Today, we are privileged to host a true pioneer in the world of science. A man whose groundbreaking work has redefined how we understand the complexity of life. Dr. Denis Noble is a world-renowned physiologist, biologist, and an intellectual force who has consistently pushed the boundaries of scientific thought. From developing the first mathematical model of the human heart's electrical activity in 1960, a breakthrough that transformed cardiac medicine and paved the way for modern electrophysiology, to his profound contributions in system biology. Dr. Noble's career is a testament to the power of interdisciplinary exploration. Dr. Noble is also a leading voice in the ongoing dialogue about evolution. As a co-founder of the third way of evolution, he challenges the conventional narratives of Neo-Darwinism, advocating for a more integrative and nuanced understanding of life's origins and diversity. Please join me in welcoming the remarkable Dr. Denis Noble. Dr. Denis Noble, welcome to my podcast, and I do thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Very happy to meet with you and to discuss.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's get straight to it, shall we? Now, we do understand that you hold a very different view to what we refer to as the modern synthesis or the textbook biology. You believe it is now done for all practical purposes, and you've also given a number of foundations of the Neo-Darwinism that includes the Central Dogma and so forth, and you believe all of those positions are no longer scientifically speaking tenable, therefore it's done. So let us start with the Central Dogma. Now, as we understand, the view is that the proteins are essential for all forms of life, and the journey travels in a one direction, that is the DNA. From DNA, information goes into the RNA, and from there it goes to the ribosome within the cell, and then from there the instructions, as it were executed and the new proteins are formed. When you say that this position is flawed, do you mean this sequence and the flow of the process that is flawed, or do you hold that the instructions that the DNA gives, again, this is the language I'm using, which is normally used in the scientific literature, that information is not originated by the DNA itself, but it actually is required by the body, and the DNA then executes the requirement by giving out that information?
Very good question indeed, because the central dogma of molecular biology has been very badly misunderstood. I studied carefully what Francis Crick wrote. First in 1958, when he first formulated the central dogma as a straight fact that one goes from DNA to protein, no way of going back again. And therefore, he and many other people concluded that that means the organism has no control over its DNA. It just inherits whatever it inherits. It can do nothing about it. And the DNA forms the protein, then forms the organism, and that's a one-way process. Now, that's where the misinterpretation comes. Just ask this question: what was happening during the COVID pandemic? We all experienced a new virus. Our immune systems detected that was the case. It also knew that it did not have the shape of immunoglobulin to attack the virus. So what did it do? It told its cells to start mutating in a very specific part of the genome, just a tiny part that codes for the grabbing part of the immunoglobulin. The organism itself, not consciously, but the organism itself was changing its genes. Now, the original interpretation of the central dogma is that's not possible. Well, my answer to that is, first of all, study the immune system, because it clearly does it. Now, why can it do it? And that's because DNA on its own is actually dead. If I took the DNA out of one of my cells, perhaps a sperm cell, just to be specific, I could, as Richard Dawkins told me 2 years ago, inscribe it on granite blocks keep it for 10,000 years, and then what he told me 2 years ago was, well, we could make Denis Noble again. I replied, that's a very interesting idea, Richard, but you can't. And he asked the question, why not? I said, Richard, where would you get my mother's egg cell as it was in February of 1936? What you didn't appreciate is that that contains information that then, as the development of the embryo occurs, communicates information from that egg cell to the DNA. And that includes when it gets activated. Our bodies activate the genes, not the other way around. The genes don't activate us, we activate the genes.
We activate the genes, and obviously the external factors, they have a lot to do as well with that. And I mean, there are two questions come to mind straight away. Number one is when we say that we control the genes, and obviously, um, it we can't mean that our mind, the central software that governs our existence, that is going to have a direct impact on every cell, and it will tell every cell what to do. Um, it surely must mean that the it must happen at much more local level, i.e., at a cellular level, which goes to your other point that you've made, and it's well established that you believe that the organisms, they have the agency and they can think for themselves. Is this how we relate to it?
Yes. That's all correct. Yes. Now, can we consciously change our genes? How they are activated, and if necessary, can they be changed? Obviously, we don't send consciously aware messages to the genome. That we can't do. But what we can do is to make use of what we already know to adjust our lifestyle so that in the end we do precisely that.
Okay.
How do we do that? I'll give an example. When I was young, straight after the Second World War, we were starved during the Second World War. I was born with very thin muscular structure. I exercised very strongly. I used to do cycling, very good exercise. What that did was to tell the genes in my body to make more myosin and actin proteins. Now, we were not consciously, we aren't consciously aware that that's what we're doing, but in practice, by choosing that lifestyle, we are in effect controlling what our genes are doing to be activated.
Yeah.
Similarly, if we take the right precautions to protect our immune system, keep it in good shape with the appropriate nutrition, we will in effect be helping the immune system to do what it does when it changes the genome in response to a virus. So you're quite correct. We don't, as it were, consciously say, I now want to change my genes, but we, through knowledge of what is available to us as options in life, we can in effect control what is happening to the genome, both how it is activated and whether or not it needs changing. That's the way I see it. So, what do bacteria do when they are attacked with antibiotics? They mutate quickly. They they enable forms of themselves to evolve that can escape from the antibiotic effect. That's already established. Now, again, I don't think the bacterium, in a sense, consciously, deliberately says, I want to change my genes. These are built in. That's the way I think to see it. And if we have the right kind of strategy in life, that's where the agency comes in, then we can, in effect, determine how well our genome is protected, how well it is activated, and how well it is, what's the word I want, cultivated by our immune system. That's the way I would put it. All of these things are indirect, but they're still very effective.
Well, that's wonderful. It's very clear. Um, I think it's quite appropriate at this juncture to also include the Weissmann Barrier. It's something that you certainly disagree with,
Right, yes,
and from what I understand, Charles Darwin certainly disagreed with, at least on 6 occasions
indeed.
within his publications. Now, when we say that the agency is there, and given the circumstantial change, the DNA can be changed, and even though we don't say that it's a conscious driven experience, but it
Exactly.
happens. But then the question is that if that happens within a lifetime to a particular organism, to a particular body, i.e., a human body, those effects can be transferred to the next generation. So we are not saying that it's only
Yes,
the germline mutations, as the wording of the literature is, but even the somatic changes, they can be transmitted to the next generation, which effectively means that there is no such thing as Weissmann barrier. Would that be a fair assessment?
that's correct. And I think here it's best to go back to Charles Darwin because he very specifically formulated a theory to deal with the question of use and disuse in the body and how functional use and disuse could be transmitted to the next generation. Why did he do that, first of all? He did that because he was a very careful thinker. After formulating the theory of natural selection in his 1858 paper to the Linnean Society, and then again in his book 1859, The Origin of Species, he thought further and he realized that that in itself could not explain the evolutionary process as we have observed it. Now, what was creating that difficulty in his mind? It's what he knew about the alternative to natural selection, which is in chapter 1 of his book, The Origin of Species, which is artificial selection. Now, artificial selection is real selection. That's us, humans, as breeders of cattle, breeders of plants, breeders of chickens, doesn't matter what it might be. We, in effect, develop new varieties of those species. Now, the interesting point is this: it will only develop into a complete new variety from which you can breed truly, provided you stop reproduction between the varieties. Once you allow the varieties to breed amongst themselves, you will lose the development of those varieties. You will revert to the common species characteristics. So he realized that something would have to make sure that there was branching so that this variety could go that way and that variety that way, not breed between them. Now, he'd had the experience of the Galapagos Islands, where the islands geographically provide that. So he had no difficulty in envisaging that, yes, the speciation could occur in the different islands, which is precisely what we think has happened. The finches are all different, the tortoises are different, and so on, and specific to each island. But of course, the great majority of the Earth is not like that. Um, what is necessary for branching speciation is how do you stop the interbreeding? And this puzzled him. How could it be that in great swathes of the earth, different species could branch out from a common origin? And you can only imagine that if there is some process by which there could be some interference with the breeding between them. Now we come to the question of what could be an alternative process in addition to the natural selection that he outlined in 1859. And he realized that since he could observe the fact that some organisms have, through disuse, even lost major organs. For example, fish that are blind, living in caves, water in caves with no light, just simply lose the eyesight. They don't have eyes anymore. Now, what he realized is this would require some transmission from the organism sensing there's no light, I've no use for my eyes, or however you want to put it, um, and in some way communicating that to the next generation. He then invented an idea. He said, I don't know exactly how this happens, but we would have to postulate, and he agreed it was a postulation, just a hypothesis, that some information goes from the soma cells, that's the body cells, to the germ cells in the cells that are going to form the future egg and sperm. And he postulated that there would be tiny particles of information. I'm using modern language, of course. He called them gemmules, but we don't need to worry about the word he used. Now, he freely admitted this is something I can't prove at the moment. Light microscopy in the 19th century would not have been able to detect what we now know happens. All cells in our bodies pour out precisely what Darwin was postulating. Tiny vesicles, little packets of chemicals from the cells, which critically contain RNAs and proteins that activate and determine what happens to the germline DNA when it forms a new organism. So it carries the information, for example, about metabolic state, about the general biochemistry and physiology of the soma cells to the germline. There isn't a barrier. There may be as a sort of physical barrier. The germline is indeed carefully protected in many respects in the various organs that the male and female of the species have and have to protect. We know that. But there is no complete barrier, that's the way to put it, I think, to the passage of this information. Now, what we now know is that there are masses of examples of this kind of transmission occurring. Only last year, with a student here in Oxford, Daniel Phillips, I published a paper called Bubbling Beyond the Barrier. And it gives the message very clearly. Those packets of information passed, just as Darwin postulated, to the germline to transmit on to the future generation. Now, what we now need to do is to encourage researchers to investigate how often does that happen? Does it account for this period of transmission of information? If you starve a nation, as happened in, for example, Holland during the Second World War, it's called the Dutch starvation winter, you find that the metabolic effects of that, obesity in particular, have been transmitted down several generations now. The postulation, of course, would be that during those years of starvation, the mothers were passing that kind of metabolic information to the germline, so were the fathers. So both the sperm and the egg would be susceptible to receiving all of that. Now, I'm not saying we understand perfectly what exactly gets transmitted, how it does it all, and so on. I'm saying we now know that there is transmission through the germ line. We should encourage those researchers who want to pursue all of this and find out the implications for health and disease, because believe me, they're big.
I mean, this is.
So,
I'm
no
glad
Weissmann.
you've. No, no Weissmann barrier. That is now scientifically speaking, it's also proven, and I'm really glad that you brought up the Dutch famine towards the end of the Second World War. Now, my audience primarily they are Urdu speaking, which is a local language here we speak here in Pakistan. And I've made a series called Darwinism versus Science, and in which I gave a great amount of detail of the Dutch famine and how even the children who were born out of uh, the 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 children who were in their mother's womb, and how that behavior carried forward to the next generation, and that the natural selection simply can't account for it. And the reason I call that series Darwinism versus science is because us, the religious people, we are the outcasts. So the moment we talk about evolution or Darwinism in particular, the first allegation we face is, oh, you guys are against science. And we explain to them that, look, having a scientific critique on Darwinism is actually a scientific endeavor. It's not anti-science. And I've went into the great detail of it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, that's one. I mean, I'm really seeing this as an endorsement coming from your side because um,
Well,
people like me, we
is proven. I don't think it's any longer in doubt. It's proven. And as I said, this is an opportunity for researchers around the world to take more seriously the lifestyle of one generation and how it affects the next generation. And, well, just to take that one example of obesity, there is an obesity pandemic effectively
yeah,
in, for example, the United
in
States,
the US,
and it's
yes.
beginning to occur here in the UK. I don't know what the situation is in Pakistan, but what I think we can say is that this is a crisis that leads to many things that develop because being overweight, being obese, having all of those metabolic characteristics is not good for one's general health. That's clear. So when I say that, I'm a physiologist, I teach medical students, I care about what they know in relation to healthcare. And I think it's very important that we correct these major errors in the fundamentals of biology.
Mm. Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more on that. But at this point during our talk, it also gives us the opportunity as to why it doesn't happen. So, if I may shift from the technical side of evolution to more of the cultural side of it, Dr. Noble, one of my chief disagreements, I'm giving you a bit of background as to why I have this very strong opinion about Darwinism is I saw the proponents of Darwinism as, or Neo-Darwinism to be more precisely, be more precise. I've seen the proponents in a much different to what you normally expect a proponent of any theory to be. Mostly, there's a lot of hostility, there is a lot of arrogance, there isn't any humbleness or saying that we don't know, therefore we are open to it. Mostly it is we don't know, but if you doubt it, it's your fault. And that kind of aggression, and this is not just one or two people we are talking about. We are talking about a whole paradigm of people who believe Darwinism to be still true. And I understand you've been a victim of it as well. You mentioned somewhere that they've put boiling oil on you for holding different views. And the thing is that it's so easy for me to talk to someone like yourself that even if I disagree on some point, we're open to a discussion. And obviously, you will be correcting me a lot more than I could ever imagine. But still, we are having a conversation. I just don't find that culture of openness and dialogue among proponents of Darwinism. Mostly it is very hostile, very aggressive. Can we, I mean, the Michael Ruse, even though he does believe in evolution himself, but he believes, he wrote a book, it's called Darwinism as a Religion. Do you see that type of hostility that is more of dogma? And sorry, the question got a little bit longer, but if I can put it this way in the end, that maybe the central dogma in biology is not true, but the dogma within the Darwinism or the Darwinism proponents, they are very dogmatic people, and that hostility is something which is really uncalled for.
Yes, I think first of all it'd be worth explaining exactly what happened. What we refer to as neo-Darwinism is not Darwinism. That's the first thing to make very clear. Darwin would be, I think, shocked that that name has become attached and uses his own name. He was not a neo-Darwinist. In fact, he specifically disagreed with Alfred Russel Wallace, who was the first person to break with him in 1866. I've done all the historical research on this. And he disagreed with, or would have disagreed with, Weissmann, who formulated the barrier just after his death, after Darwin's death. I think it was 1883. Darwin died in 1882. But he'd already outlined why he would disagree with Weissmann, because he formulated the theory that the soma does connect to the germline. He didn't know about Weissmann's invention of a barrier, but he knew there was transmission. He would never have agreed with Weissmann. And he also disagreed with Galton, his own cousin, incidentally. Francis Galton was the origin of eugenics and formulated that I think around the late part of the 1860s. And Darwin also took very strongly against that. So, what became Neo Darwinism, in effect, Wallace, Galton, and Weissmann as the originators, is not something he would have agreed with. That's the first point. The second is that there was then, towards the beginning of the 20th century, in the 1900s, there was a fusion with what Gregor Mendel had found in relation to genetics in plants. Of course, he was doing it on pea plants. And that led progressively during the first half of the 20th century to the formulation of what is now called the modern synthesis, sometimes also called neo-Darwinism. There's a bit of a confusion here, but don't let's get too much into the detail of that. What is clear is that there's a line from neo-Darwinism, not originally Darwinism, through to the modern synthesis formulated by Julian Huxley in 1942. That book is interesting. I've been through it very carefully. The 1942 book, except for his acceptance of Weissmann's idea, is very open. You might find that surprising. We're so used to the modern modern synthesis evolutionary biologists being very firm and holding to a line that we might be surprised by that. But there are many things in the 1942 book that I would agree with. What happened? The Central Dogma came along in 1958. By the early 1960s, Julian Huxley revised the modern synthesis. There was a second edition. And in that, he said, we have now to accept that the proteins are no longer the drivers of life, it's DNA. Because he thought that what Crick meant by the central dogma was precisely how Julian Huxley and many other people interpreted it, to mean it's impossible for the organism to control its DNA. Now, that's, I think, the origin of the dogmatism. It's around the 1960s, with interaction with what was happening in molecular biology. The central dogma of molecular biology then became hardened. It was even, and you'll find this on the internet everywhere, it's even stated that the central dogma is now the embodiment of the Weissmann Barrier. Well, the central dogma is about molecules, DNA and proteins, RNAs. Um, the Weissmann Barrier is about whole cells. You know, the difference is absolutely enormous. From the viewpoint of a molecule, a cell is as big as Pakistan, the whole country. It's that different. To confuse talking about molecules, which can only do what molecules can do chemically, with what cells can do, which have got agency, is a big, big confusion. Only the cell itself has the agency that we're talking about.
Now, that is fine. I
Now,
think we Please go on.
I want to add one other thing, because you've
Please.
raised, I think, something very important, and you've done it by implication so far, but I'm sure you feel it too. What I think then happened was a direct clash between the, I would call them the fundamentalists in both camps, religious camps and the scientific camps, and very strongly so in the United States, not so much here in the United Kingdom. I've met with very major religious leaders, uh, people like the former Archbishop of Canterbury and many others I've discussed with. I'm not a religious believer myself. I should say that immediately, so you know where I'm coming from. But I do respect other people's beliefs, and that I think we should do. We all have a right to think about the things that are deep and how we think everything might have started or not, or however we think about it. That's a matter of personal belief, and I respect that. But what happened was the development of essentially a war between the hardened modern synthesis evolutionary biologists in the United States. I'm thinking of people like Jerry Coyne and people who think like him. And they thought they had to, as it were, fight the creationists amongst the religious believers. Now, not all religious believers are creationists. That's the first point to make absolutely clear. What I find in discussing with religious leaders here in the United Kingdom, exceedingly few of them now would describe themselves as creationists in that sense. But unfortunately, and I think this is a great misfortune, that developed in the United States into a kind of standoff, even a legal standoff. Do we or do we not have the right to teach evolution in our schools? Though, I mean, that led, of course, to what people have often described as a kind of war. And I think that's extremely unfortunate, because dogmatism has no role in science. Arriving at a dogmatic position is absurd in science. We are all, as scientists, ready and should be ready to face the possibility that our ideas are wrong. We're looking at that at the moment in our ideas about the universe, because of what the new telescope has shown us about looking deep into space. And we should be open to saying, well, we need to think this through very carefully. And indeed, of course, cosmologists, the physicists responsible for that, are thinking it through. And I think the same should apply to the fundamentals of biology as much as to the fundamentals of physics and cosmology. That's why I formulated a theory of biological relativity, as I call it. The idea that there's causation going in both directions, from the organism to the molecular level and from the molecular level to the organism. It's both ways, and you can't separate the two.
Okay, that's fantastic. And when you've alluded to the history that the religious camp and the Darwinist camp, I wouldn't say evolutionist camp because there are different renditions of it. Um, I think
Sure.
within that legal standoff, people like yourself became an unintended victims, because when the
That's right.
creationist people, when they sort of rebounced with the intelligent design theory, and there's a lot of debate whether it's a scientific theory or it's not, but leaving that aside, the legal standoff in the Dover board case, I think the decision there is that the Darwinism is the only thing that can be taught as the explanation of life. Not only it has shut down, shut the door of religion into it, but also any other explanation apart from Darwinism has also become victim of it. So I think that was unfortunate, and that is something which
Yeah.
is something needs to be reviewed. Now, moving to some other, some controversial side now. I know that yourself and other colleagues at the Third Way of Evolution, you dissuade people like myself from using your arguments in favor as the as the arguments for creationism, by the implication that if we can prove Darwinism wrong, then creationism is the only thing which is left standing, and you don't want us to do it. But we do it anyway, and we do thank you for giving us a lot of material.
That's entirely up to those who wish to take that line. Yes, exactly. But I think we should all respect each other's arguments. I discuss with people who are, in one sense or another, creationists, and I'm perfectly happy to discuss. What I do, though, is to and indeed, I did it at the end of one of my major books on biological relativity. The last chapter of my little book, Dance to the Tune of Life, is called The Relativity of Epistemology. Now, that's a long phrase, but what it really means is let's admit also what we cannot and do not know and remain open minded. So I've taken the view yes, we should discuss all of these things. After all, some of the evolutionary biologists in the past thought there were individual creations. The big opponent of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck in the early 1800s was a man called Georges Cuvier. And he very seriously opposed Lamarck, who was thinking there was, as it were, a simple branching. In fact, he drew a tree of life well before Charles Darwin did. He drew it in 1809, 28 years before Darwin first drew a tree of life. So he'd got the idea that there was a single, if you like, creation and branching out along to various different species. Cuvier was in disagreement with it. He said, no, there have been multiple creations. Now, that was an argument and a discussion that had to occur within the early 1800s. Incidentally, Cuvier was extremely upset with Lamarck. He gave the oration, or rather an oration that was read at Lamarck's funeral when he died, a poor man, and was just thrown into a lime pit. But that funeral oration has damaged the reputation of Lamarck all the way down through more than 200 years now. So this dogmatism that's arisen over the issue of creation, evolution, what kind of mix was there, has dominated these areas for at least 200 years now. But now to return to where I'm positioned, I think we should allow researchers to openly investigate what has happened and not lay down rules about what can be funded, what can be regarded as valid questions, and be much more open. And when I said earlier on in this, or I agreed with what you attributed to me, that I refer to it as having boiling oil poured over me, is from very direct experience. I helped to organize a major meeting at the National Academy of the United Kingdom in 2016, just 8 years ago. And that's a process that takes around 2 years of very careful planning. You put a proposal to the Royal Society, as we call the National Academy here in the United Kingdom, and it's investigated by a committee, because if you succeed in the proposal to hold a meeting, it will be funded by the Royal Society. And we did it jointly with the other academy, what's called the British Academy, which is where the philosophers, historians, and humanities people were. So we put it to both academies. And the title of our meeting was The Implications of New Ideas in Evolutionary Biology for the Social Sciences. That meeting was approved by the detailed committees considering it in both academies during the period between 2014 and 2015, finally agreement that the meeting should go ahead. That was actually agreed unanimously by the Committee of the Royal Society. It was announced with an advertisement open to the public, anybody could come, that there would be a discussion meeting held at the Royal Society, but jointly sponsored by the two academies in the November of 2016. And its title would be what I've just said, Implications of New Trends in Evolutionary Biology for the Social Sciences, Philosophy, History, and so on. Within a few weeks of that advertisement appearing, a protest letter was sent to the Royal Society by extremely distinguished scientists, 21 of them all fellows of the Royal Society, highly distinguished biologists, asking the president of the society, please arrange that this meeting should no longer be sponsored by the Royal Society. Why? I quote from their protest. This is a little bit like allowing a homeopathist to organize a meeting on clinical medicine. That was directed specifically at me. I've never worked
Fair
on
take.
homeopathy in any case. It's not an invention of Eastern people. It's an invention in Germany a number of years ago. But that's just a minor detail. This was a deliberate smear. There was a crisis because that's very unusual. A protest like that from within the academy, not from outside, not a group of creationists doing it, a group of fundamentalist evolutionary biologists doing it. This was within the academy itself. We had meetings with the office. The obvious thing to do was to discuss. So we discussed, and in fact, one of the officers of the Royal Society met with some of the people who were involved in the protest and asked what they wanted. And they wanted what we were already giving. They wanted that there should be some people at this meeting who would present the standard orthodox view. We'd already done that. It was unnecessary. The whole protest was completely unnecessary. We recognize that if you have a discussion meeting on new trends in evolutionary biology, you should allow those who think there are no new trends a platform. You should allow them to also present. And we did. It's strange. You see, the motto of the Royal Society is a Latin motto, nullius in verba, which means,
Absolutely.
in a sense, don't accept people's word for it. Investigate,
Yes.
research,
Question everything.
discuss, assess. This is the way to go with science. Now, I've taken a vow. I will never reveal who signed that letter. I hope that eventually, as the truth percolates out, that there are fundamental mistakes in 20th century biology that need correcting, and we need to allow more open research on the issues involved. I think that I would like to expect that those who signed that letter should think again. I don't want to shame them in public, but that's where the boiling oil analogy occurred. I would like them to rethink what they did and ask the question, is this how science should be done?
Exactly, and that is the most important question. That, Dr. Noble, is the most important question because, look, if you look at the allegations that are normally apportioned at the religious people, is that they are not reasonable, they are emotionally driven, and they are very quickly on using labels on people and so forth. I mean, some of it is true, some of it is exaggerated, but it certainly happens. We accept that. But when you see similar sort of behavior from the people who are standing in opposition of religious ideas, i.e., the creationism, for example, when you see them doing exactly the same thing, it just makes one wonder, and certainly happened to me. I mean, my chief, or one of the chief reasons for disagreeing right at the outset from Darwinism was that the behavior is not scientific. I mean, we see physics, we see chemistry, we see a number of other scientific branches where you see a lot of humility and humbleness among scientists and say that if we don't know something, well, it means we don't know something. But when it comes to
Precisely.
Darwinism, it's completely different. It's very hostile. Even in my work in Pakistan, people who believe Darwinism to be the absolute truth, and by the way, it might come as a surprise or it might not, that we have people here who teach Darwinism and they believe that the modern synthesis, the central dogma, modern synthesis itself, that is the latest development in the science, and say, whether you agree with the rest of the developments or you don't, but you can't ignore those developments to be there. But this is, unfortunately, what the paradigm is, that this is what you have to agree to, and if you don't, then you belong to Stone Ages, you're a regressive person, you're anti science, and so forth, which is quite extraordinary. Now, we did say that we are moving away from the technical side to more of the cultural side, but let's get back into the technical side. A couple of questions. I realize I've taken a lot of your time already. Now, that goes
That's
to
what,
the thank you. Well, it goes to the agency side. Now, you say the organisms, they do have agency, which means that with the changing circumstances, they can change the DNA, and even the sequence from DNA to proteins does not prohibit the organisms from changing its DNA. You are very clear on this. You're on record for saying that, and there's a the clear meaning of that is that the agency is there. But when
yeah,
your critique on selfish gene materializes, it's almost invariably dismissive on the grounds that the genes can't be selfish because chemicals do what chemicals do, i.e., they do bonding, and the rest of the processes they also go about their business as they are determined to be, which means that it's a complete lack of agency there. So where do we draw the line when it comes to reconciling these ideas? Because it seems that you believe that there is agency at the cellular level, but there is no agency when it comes to the string level or the genes level. How do we make sense of
exactly.
this?
Well, I'm a computer programmer. I'm very famous, actually. I say it
Of course,
myself
you are.
for having worked out 64 years ago as a student at University College London. I worked out how the rhythm of the heart is generated from molecular processes. That's what I did. And I programmed a very early computer, very slow valve computer, enormous machine, not like a laptop that you can get today and do computations that are vastly more complicated than I did then. Now, what I notice when you write a computer program, if it's going to be representing flexible activity, you've got to have the flexible clauses in the program. If this, then that, else something else. And you can stack these as many times as you like, and what you get is an extremely open system that can respond to what the data is that's coming into it. That's how you make an AI. That's how you make artificial intelligence work. It's just a bunch of computers. It's just silicon, processing the ones and zeros. However, if you look in the genome at the C's, T's, A's, and G's, all the nucleotides arranged 3 billion pairs going through a human genome, you will not find that kind of program. There's nothing there. That there are switches in genomes, just near, usually near, but sometimes a distance, a particular sequence of DNA coding for a protein, there will be a switch. But that switch is activated by the processes that are open, like my computer program, to the data coming in, which is the environment influencing the organism. So you can only attribute agency to something that has that degree of openness. And with my brother, I've outlined exactly how we think that happens. It's a tiny book produced by Cambridge University Press last year called Understanding Living Systems. And we declare at the very beginning agency is a fundamental characteristic of all living organisms. And if you don't start with that assumption, you're not respecting the openness, the ability to almost do anything in regard to the environment and what the conditions are in which you're living. Without that openness, you don't have agency. The chemicals don't have that. So I think it's very simple. The organism as a whole certainly has it. I think that's almost definitive of life. Now, we can ask some very interesting questions then. How does agency arise? That's equivalent to asking the question, how did a bunch of chemicals come to become part of a living organism? I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. There's one of the open questions. There are people doing research on it. Can we, from what we know, work out how a bunch of chemicals could somehow or another come together to form an organism? But that's an open question. The point I'm making is, however it happened, and that's the open question, however it happened, that is what organisms are capable of doing. If we attribute that to artificial intelligence, then it doesn't make sense to not attribute it to you and me. That is absurd because we are the paradigm of intelligence that the artificial intelligence people are trying to develop. So I think it's very simple. I would argue, as my brother Raymond and I, he's a zoologist, incidentally, by training. Um, we've argued that it's characteristic of organisms that they have agency, and that's because they're open to what the environment influences them to experience.
This is fascinating, and I think this is where I can put another view here, that us, the theist people, how do we make sense of it? And of course, we
Yeah,
we don't mean at this stage making a theological case for God, but it's more of a philosophical case for God. And let me make the argument and present the case. And I want to make sure that I fully express myself for your benefit. So
yeah,
it might take a minute to 2 minutes, but I'll try to be as quick as I can.
that's
We hold
sure.
that there are only two types of things, either contingent beings or necessary beings. Contingent things, they need to have two essential characteristics that make them contingent. Number one, that they are dependent on something else. And number two, they cannot explain the existence and the purpose of their existence themselves. So you have to find those explanations elsewhere. And a necessary being, by definition, is something that is impossible to not exist. It is going to exist. It's impossible for it to not exist. So, with that understanding, we apply a question on the biological entities, the organisms, that whether these
Mm,
organisms are necessary or are they contingent. And the answer is, well, they are
okay.
contingent, because whilst we know that they do exist, but it's perfectly possible that they don't, which means that they don't necessarily exist. Now, if they don't necessarily exist, then their existence is contingent. And if they can't explain the existence, the purpose, and the agency, that means that has to be sought elsewhere. And when we go elsewhere and look for the explanation, and we will find the explanation, then we ask the same question whether this explanation was contingent or was it necessary. And then we look at the another, if that explanation is not necessary, and then we go backwards on this sequence of cause and effect, and finally we conclude that there has to be a first uncaused cause that explains everything. Otherwise, we will end up in the realm of infinite regress, and that is pretty much unthinkable exercise. It simply doesn't solve anything. So we, at this stage, we don't go whether it's Allah who has done it, or Jesus, or Christian, or anybody else for that matter. We just say there has to be a creator, and that's not a theological case. So it's
That's
not a
perfectly
theological
fine.
case; it's more of a philosophical case. And this is how we start our
Well,
journey and
yes,
end up believing in God.
well, it even led some philosophers, Spinoza notably, to a very interesting view of what he thought as you put it, the first cause was, and he put it in Latin, Deus sive natura, God or the universe or nature. Nature, of course, was being used there for the world, um, and of course he was kicked out of his Amsterdam synagogue for having these views. That's another story.
Was
Don't need to
excommunicated.
go
Yeah.
into that. No,
Yeah.
that's right. But I fully understand the argument, and I go to the point of saying, well, um, the one thing I think I cannot answer is that, because coming back now to the question of the origin of life, that's still an open question. Of course, there's a very strong natural tendency for scientists to think somehow or other we'll understand the chemistry and the physics of the world such that we can then understand the way in which a living organism can come together. But we don't have that knowledge at the moment. And I take it as an open issue. That's why the last chapter of my book, Dance to the Tune of Life, has the title The Relativity of
Activity
Epistemology.
of epistemology.
The
Yeah.
remain open to the possibility that we've got our understanding of the world deeply wrong. And isn't that what the cosmologists are now faced with? We developed from very good observations made with earlier telescopes the theory that we know when the universe was formed, where the universe as we know it, we put it at 13.8 billion years ago, that it started off as an extremely compact thing, which exploded out and developed into what we now see. But that's a theory.
Yeah.
Nobody
Yeah.
can say with any certainty that is correct. And what people are doing now that the James Webb Telescope is producing more and more information is re-examining that theory, right down to the fundamentals of what actually do we mean by some of the terms we are using. Hawking, of course, went so far with the so-called Big Bang model. He went so far as to say, well, it was the invention of time, if you want to call it that, which is very strange. I don't even begin to understand that. I am to some extent philosophically trained, and I respect a lot of philosophy. I think the arguments from, for example, Descartes in the 17th century as to how we have agency but animals don't. Well, Darwin would certainly not have agreed with that. I think it's absurd. And the arguments that occurred between, well, not directly between him and Spinoza, but Spinoza represented the other extreme. You can once you give um, some sense of integrative activity. I think that's the way we put it in modern language to an organism. You're moving to very, very different issues that are raised. And he, as a philosopher, I think, fully understood that. But to come back to the point, I feel that we have to remain open to the possibility that our understanding of the universe is, at the moment, seriously in question as to how much we really do understand. We do not know yet how to resolve conflicts between our ideas of quantum mechanics and our ideas of special and general relativity. We don't know, therefore, how to produce a complete account of what we observe. And for so long as that is true, and it may always be true as far as I know, I think we should remain open. That's why I give, let me put it this way philosophically, metaphysical speculation, because that's what I would call it, um, reign to try and see what one can understand. And metaphysics should not be regarded as necessarily religious. I know this is a contentious issue, but I'm trying to explain my own position as carefully as I can, as you now explained yours. Um, I think that there is no doubt that we use speculations about what exists and what can function even in our scientific theories. Whoever has met the square root of -1. Now, Why is it important? It's important because although nobody can ever have met something like that, you can't have a square root of -1 number of apples or number of bananas. Yet, in mathematics, that is an exceedingly useful idea. And I see many aspects of metaphysics as more or less in that kind of category. Just one example, if you take somebody like Jerry Coyne, a strong neo-Darwinist in the United States, in his book, Why Evolution is True, and what he's stated since then, he thinks about the question of our agency, and he says, and I quote almost exactly, we have an extraordinary illusion that evolution has developed in us, that we can choose, that we have agency, is the way I would put it. But we don't. That's his belief, that's his metaphysics. We don't have
That
agency.
is metaphysics, yes.
Right. And then he goes, that's where his metaphysics is. But then he goes on to the extraordinary statement. But we can ponder why evolution has developed this illusion in us. Now, what is pondering? It is thought. Thought about what? Do we agree with Coyne or disagree with Coyne? Are we not making a choice, whichever way we go? And he is encouraging us to make that choice in the implicit understanding that he knows we've got agency, and yet he denies it.
It
I
denies, right? Yeah.
conclude a physical argument to show why that is incoherent. And I think the test of metaphysics is it coherent? Does it form a logical whole? And I respect, therefore, religious believers who think they can see a logical whole in what they believe. Don't wish them to feel anything other than that if that's what they feel. But I also reserve the right to have my logical whole, which is my own metaphysics, which there is considerable doubt about what do we really know in the deep sense of these fundamental questions, which at the moment certainly we can't answer, and possibly, in my deeper feelings about it, possibly we will never answer. Maybe there just is a limit to what we can know.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I think that limitation is what makes us very exciting beings because is looking for the limitation at subjective level as well as at the objective level as well. And this
Yes,
experience for me, Dr. Noble, is such refreshing that I'm talking to a scientist who is humble enough to state that, look, if we don't know, we don't know. Because mostly my time is spent with Darwinists, and there's nothing like this. And the we've discussed metaphysics, we've discussed the square root of -1, and obviously with the further imaginative exercises of going into the number pi and from there finding way into the quantum physics and then wondering without metaphysics what one could do given the fact that it was the imagination that opened the realm of something which took us to subatomic level, which is brilliant. And the metaphysics in that regard can't be uh, denied. And what I wouldn't go as far as saying frustrates me, but what certainly surprises me is that the people, just like Jerry Coyne, you mentioned, that he used the one of the important modes, that is the agency, and then using that free will to conclude that there is no free will. Uh, I think it's quite consistent when it comes to favoring a very astute anti-religious view from a scientific premise. For example, Richard Dawkins is well famous for saying that the universe looks designed, but it isn't. Now, if we divide this statement into two parts and look at the first one and see whether it's a scientific statement, and quite clearly it is, because universe indeed looks designed. I mean, you can do the experimentation of it, you can do the observation of it, no problem. But the second part, that it isn't, is not a scientific statement because we can't falsify it. We don't know.
yes, exactly.
Yeah, so and that's a metaphysical claim right there. But then to use such claims to deny metaphysics and so forth. And again, I fully agree with you that the metaphysics can exist independent of religion. It doesn't have to be religiously bound. But the way in which we look at it is the inquiry that takes us beyond what is physical, and then we find the answers, and we find the answers in the creator. That gives us closure, and obviously this is our way of thinking. um, and this is fascinating that we've come that close, and and now the difference is that a party claims to
I
know and
think it
party
is.
claims not to know. Yeah,
Yes, indeed. I think it is. And I think this is the kind of discussion and debate we should be having. When I well, I referred to Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, and I've talked with quite a number of religious leaders, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I've spoken to monks in East Asia, and a totally different tradition there because they've got a kind of, well, if I can put it this way, a kind of godless religion. They have a religion that doesn't include God. I mean, now I don't pretend to understand a lot of this. What I can say though is this: it is absolutely fascinating discussing with such people. We're not talking about people who think the world is only 7,000 years old. We're not talking about people who think that there was some kind of set of magical tricks performed. We're talking about very serious thinkers about
yeah,
the deep questions to which we don't really have good answers. And my way of thinking about this is we should recognize that in each other. We're all struggling to make sense of what we find in the world and what we believe is the case. And I think that this openness to discussion is precisely what we should have. I've had no difficulty discussing with intelligent design people if they wish to take the view that this implies that there is something out there, who knows what, that
yeah,
created it all. Fine, that's their position and their way of resolving the big dilemmas in life. I take it much as I take the character in Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, marvelous book, incidentally. One of his characters um, writes or says in his novel Anna Karenina, if I do not know where I came from, why I am here, and why I have or can I have purpose, I cannot live. This wasn't a statement that in itself implies a particular metaphysics. He was crying out as a human being, I need to know that I have a purpose. Well, my answer to that would be, you do. And if you think you don't, that's absurd. That is itself an incoherent metaphysics. And that's why I think Jerry Coyne is incoherent. Um, Now, as I said, we all come to our conclusions about the metaphysics of the world. And that's what we should be debating, should be discussing calmly and in a way that enables us to think deeply, not be dismissed. When I discussed with Richard Dawkins 2 years ago, at the festival here in the United Kingdom, run by the Institute of Art and Ideas. Um, we had a very courteous discussion all the way through the 1 hour or so of the recording. It's all online, and people can go to my website and find it very easily, denisnoble.com. But the important thing was we agreed in the end to agree that we disagreed on the fundamentals of biology. But I will say something else too. That recording is now completely transcribed, together with the references of all the points I made about the central dogma of molecular biology, the Weissmann Barrier, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, and the existence of agency, none of which did he reply directly. What he did was to make another ex cathedra statement. I just received only a day or two ago his latest book, The Genetic Book of the Dead. It's a beautifully written book. He has a style with writing that's absolutely extraordinary. It's got, though, a strange chapter, chapter 8, which is, he claims, his answer to me at that debate 2 years ago. All it does is say again the mantras, this is what I think is the case. Denis Noble obviously is wrong. So it doesn't. I mean, I will one day write a proper answer to all of that, but that's another matter. The point I'm making is this: we all need, it seems to me, to respect each other's metaphysics, whether religious or not. And secondly, we need also to admit what we don't know.
Okay, that's fascinating. Uh, and Richard Dawkins having a very good and civilized debate with yourself, and in the end, respectfully agreeing to disagree. I suppose it was achievable given the fact that you did have a psychological hold over him, being his teacher at some point. Uh, not sure
Well,
whether he would.
I, I was actually his thesis examiner.
Yes, you were.
Yes, he said so. I'm a bit nervous today because that gentleman over there was my thesis examiner. Well, I was actually absolutely right, but there are no selfish genes in his thesis.
Yeah, but now he's written a book, and you mentioned in one chapter he responded to you. So I guess you have to re-examine his work and give him proper feedback yet again. Uh, I have taken too much of your time. The very last question, an important question for our part of the world, is one of the cliches. The moment you start questioning the tenets of Darwinism, the straight answer or the straight uh, retort you get is, "Oh, why don't you write a research paper and prove it wrong and get the Nobel Prize?" Every time, same sequence. Prove it wrong by writing a research paper and get the Nobel. And I've been explaining to people that you don't get Nobel simply for writing a research paper. It doesn't work like that. And that there is plethora of literature available, which not only refutes the Darwinist foundations, but it does so with the backing of science. How would you respond to those
Neo-Darwinist.
people? Neo-Darwinism, sure.
Yes, yes. Well, first of all, who knows how people get Nobel prizes? I've had
Yeah.
I've had many prizes myself, including a very prestigious one from the Russian Academy of Sciences called the Grand um, Lomonosov Gold Medal, which Lomonosov was a very famous, um, well, not only scientist in Russia many years ago, but a polymath. I mean, interested in poetry, philosophy, and so on. Um, I have no idea. Why did they give it to me? Well, they do say why they gave it to me. They gave it to me because I worked out how the heart rhythm occurs. But then I would say, well, yes, that's true. I did. But, I developed it also over many years, and we still haven't finished filling in all the details. That theory I created in 1960, we now know is incorrect. I know it is. Not incorrect in a way that is shameful or cheating in any way whatsoever, but just incorrect in this sense that if that model that was very good at predicting what happens was correct, we would all be dead long ago because it's extremely fragile. By contrast, real living organisms, remember that was just a model, real living organisms are remarkably robust. You knock a gene out that's responsible for the pacemaker rhythm, it adjusts. The pacemaker cells of the heart know how to continue beating even when a major component is removed and or blocked. So I've come to a very much more nuanced position than I had way back in 1960, and yet I was awarded a big prize for precisely that discovery. Well, what I'm doing here is in a sense, answering your question. Of course, committees do what they do. They award prizes, the committees that do that. I sit on one myself in Paris. But we're all subject to making misjudgments. We think we know enough to make a good decision. We probably don't. There are many factors that play a role in whether or not people get awarded major prizes. So I would say nobody has any idea how the Nobel Prize works. I'm not even sure.
Sorry, I feel I couldn't explain the question properly. I mean, it's not that they're asking any particular person, why don't you have the Nobel? Any person who raises the question, what they're saying is that all you have to do is, and listen to this order, this sequence. All you have to do
Okay.
is write a research paper, get it published in a high impact journal, and because
Yeah.
by doing that you will have refuted neo-Darwinism completely, therefore you will
Yeah.
get the Nobel. So they're saying stop
Oh,
arguing
I
with
see.
us, go and do it in the world of science. And my point is that there is enough literature available that actually refutes it, but I just don't know
Yes, indeed.
how can I explain this to the people that it's there. Literature is there, just read it. In the question
Yes.
should be, in spite of the fact that there is a lot of literature available, why neo-Darwinism is still being taught as the standard of biology? Why is it still part of our textbooks? That should be the question, as opposed to you saying go and write another paper. So this is what frustrates me, actually.
Yes, I asked that question in 2021, writing a paper with James Shapiro, another great opponent of neo Darwinism and the modern synthesis. And we asked the question, actually, it's the title of the paper: why is it that the textbooks are so wrong? That's not the exact statement in the title, but it's essentially that. What is it that keeps neo-Darwinist or modern synthesis people from recognizing that the foundations of the subject have actually broken, and broken in 4 or 5 major ways? Central dogma does not mean we can't change genes. The Weissmann barrier does not stop messages traveling from the soma to the germline. You can go on through the list, and I've done that in many papers. Sure. Now, not quite sure where this leads to. I think, from my point of view, if I can express it in response to your question, it is I don't mind at all what people might say about whether or not one should be rewarded for deconstructing the modern synthesis or deconstructing what is called neo-Darwinism. What I feel, and feel justified by and pleased by, is that I've worked it out. I've debated it with one of the great opponents to my position, that is Richard Dawkins. I'm perfectly happy with the way things have developed, and I'm perfectly happy to be known as the person who said at some point or another, enough is enough. We need to be open in science to research.
Fantastic. So thank you so very much indeed for your precious time. It means a lot to me. And, I must admit on camera that first time when you responded to my email, that was a very special moment in my life, because I've been following your work for so long and finally been able to have an email exchange with you and finally having a podcast. It really, really is meaningful. Thank you so very much indeed for your time again.
My pleasure. It's been an enjoyable discussion.
Thank you.